So this is the Headphone 2 GT. It's the successor to the Headphone 2, but with some feedback from audiophiles incorporated. So I guess the question is, did the feedback that went into the Headphone 2 GT actually make it a stronger product for the average audiophile versus the original Headphone 2? Let's talk about that. This headphone was sent to me by headphones.com, but obviously they didn't tell me to say anything in particular about it. All the thoughts, experiences, and opinions relayed in this review are going to be my own. But if you want to support headphone reviews and educational content like we do on this channel, definitely consider making your next purchase of an IEM or headphone or DAC or amp or cable or whatever at headphones.com, because they're the ones that support this channel. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the build, design, comfort, unboxing, accessories, all that stuff. But I want to start with the unboxing and the accessories first, because this is where this headphone really impressed me the moment I took it out of the box. So when you unbox it, you get two separate compartments. You get the headphone and the accessories. If you open up the headphone compartment, what you get is Head's kind of custom molded hard shell case, which is on the large side because this headphone doesn't really collapse or anything like that. It's just kind of the way it is, but that does mean, you do need a larger case to accommodate that. That said, the case itself is quite nice, has ample room for the headphone. Seems like it would be very protective as well because it's got a hard shell exterior. But once you open the accessories portion of the package, that's when it gets interesting. The first thing that people are probably bound to notice is that it actually comes with a different set of ear pads. So I think people who buy this headphone new are going to find that it has leather pads shipped out from the factory, but I actually preferred it with the suede ear pads you can see here, mostly for comfort reasons. And that's kind of the best part about these two ear pads is that they actually measure near identically, much closer than one would expect two ear pads with a completely different material construction to have. So I think that's a really cool benefit, is that you don't have to pick comfort or sound. You basically just choose whichever one is more comfortable because they basically sound the same. So the suede's more comfortable for me, so I use the suede pads. The headphone itself uses a dual 3.5mm TS connection, and in the accessories compartment, you actually get two entire cables. So you get a 1/4-inch stereo jack, a typical unbalanced single-ended connection, but then you also get a 4.4mm Pentacon TRRS balanced cable. You also get adapters to adapt the single-ended to the smaller single-ended, so from 1/4-inch down to 1/8 inch, and you get another adapter to adapt the 4.4mm Pentacon to 4-pin XLR. But also, the cables and adapters all have this incredibly compliant braided fabric construction to them that it's an incredibly soft, ergonomic, tangle-free headphone cable. But it also has incredibly well-managed microphonics, which isn't typical of a lot of fabric cables. So right below the Y-split, where the two earpieces kind of meet at the center of the cable, if you touch right below the Y-split, there's no sound transmission at all for me. But accessories and unboxing aside, let's talk about the build and the design and, the comfort and all that stuff. So looking at this headphone, yes, it is not necessarily the most normal looking headphone, but I actually do quite like the visual design here. I like that the profile from front to back here is quite thin and slim, such that when people are looking at you from the side, it doesn't look all that weird. I do like the transparency of the grille and the kind of pattern here, how that matches with the Head's logo. I do like the fact that versus the Headphone 2, the logo here is actually just kind of black embossed instead of like printed white. The headband itself doesn't look great when worn. So this is it on my head, you get kind of the typical alien head shape. In terms of the build, I would say it feels quite solid, actually. It's definitely, a mix of plastic and metal throughout. It's definitely a little bit on the heavy side, which I think helps it feel a little bit more stable, I'm a little bit more confident holding the headphone. I do notice when I'm wearing the headphone and putting it on my head that the kind of articulation of the cup kind of produces a squeaking sound. It's not really a problem when I'm wearing the headphone and listening to music, but when I put the headphone on my head for the first time to start listening to music, that sound is a little bit annoying. On that note, let's talk about the headband, because I think that's actually the main kind of novel thing about this design. And I think it has its benefits, but it also has its detriments. So this headphone has a 2-point adjustment system for the headband like the Headphone 2 did, where you can adjust the height of this center pad by manipulating the length of this strap on top, and also the clamp of the headphone by manipulating the strap that comes along the bottom here. And Head trying to have adjustable clamp at all is, I think, something that deserves positive recognition. That said, the design isn't intuitive, really. I think most people who encounter this headphone for the first time are gonna not quite know which belt part does what. I've noticed that at shows, a lot of people put this headphone on their head feel it's uncomfortable and then don't know how to fix it. But also, unfortunately, the strap just isn't that comfortable. This padding on top is memory foam with like a slight ribbing to it, and there's maybe a little bit of a detent in the center, so it's not sitting directly on top of your head, but it's kind of making contact with 2 points kind of on the angled side of your head. I don't really like this approach, frankly. I have the same issue with the Sennheiser 6 series headband design, where it has those 2 chunks that just kind of sit on top of your head. Honestly, I think they would have been better with no pad at all and just like a kind of large surface area flexible strap. So I do wish it was kind of like taller on this axis, but also I just wish it was more flexible and kind of conformed better to the shape of the head. One of my favorite headphone mods is the Capper strap from Capper Audio, which is a very large front to back surface area and also flexible head strap that can be retrofitted onto a lot of existing headphone designs. This is one where I think Capper would have his work cut out for him, but I do really wish that head just kind of went for something a little bit simpler in terms of the actual part that touches your head, because I find that this head pad adds a little bit of unnecessary weight, but also just doesn't really cushion or help the comfort experience all that much. That said, I actually found that because this design has modular clamp force, if I went for a clampier kind of configuration, the top of head comfort got significantly better because the weight was being displaced by the inward force on the headphone being greater. So let's go ahead and talk about the sound. And this is where I think the Headphone 2 GT is kind of a benchmark if you're looking for a certain thing. So starting with the bass, this headphone's a little bit unique in that it doesn't have that kind of flat linear bass extension of a lot of planars, but also doesn't have that bump around the upper bass, mid bass area, and then just steep roll off like a lot of dynamic driver headphones do. Instead, it kind of blends the both and has almost like a meze-like upper bass presentation where there's just kind of a swell in the 100 to 200 hertz region, and then the linear bass extension underneath that. What I find is that this contributes a kind of mix of the best parts of both, where you get this kind of monolithic size to bass instruments that you get with a lot of planar magnetic headphones, but you also get a more impactful kind of punchy experience with the Headphone 2 GT than you get with a lot of those headphones, and it's kind of more similar to a dynamic driver in that sense. Now, what I'll say is this is definitely a coloration. This kind of upper bass bloom is definitely noticeable as a coloration, but I find it balances well enough with the rest of the frequency response that it sounds just kind of a little bit warm, but in a good way. What's interesting about this bass coloration is because it's elevated over the sub bass, but the sub bass is still well extended, there's a little bit of extra texture brought to like bass instruments' early overtones. You get kind of this woody throatiness that you don't really get with a lot of other headphones, and I find it really satisfying about the bass presentation on this. Now, I will say it's definitely colored, so if you're not into warm headphones and can't handle a little bit of extra low mid, I think this is probably not going to work great for you, but it actually does have colorations elsewhere in the frequency response that we should talk about that I feel balance this warmth really well. So in that spirit, moving up to the mid-range, I think most people looking at this on a graph would say it looks fairly normal. Like the rise up into the ear gain into the 2-3 kilohertz region is just kind of what you expect from a good headphone. And I would say overall, the timbre of this headphone is quite natural, I think because it nails this region. However, it also has a little bit of a spicy characteristic in that 1 to 1.5 kilohertz region that I think is typical of a lot of like Focal's headphones. But I think because this has a more forward upper bass presentation, it actually balances a little bit better than the Focal headphones and sounds a little bit more well integrated, whereas those headphones can sound a little bit boxy and kind of nasally. I don't really get that sense with this headphone. Instead, what I get is just even more heightening of that sense of like bass texture, while not going too far in the direction of like nasality or kind of crunch. It's definitely still firmly a warm headphone, but it still has texture on a lot of low-end elements, which is kind of a Goldilocks situation for warm headphones, because I find, most audiophile headphones, when it comes to the mid-range, if they go warm, they usually do so at the expense of texture and dynamism, which this one doesn't really do, which is really cool. But that brings me to the treble, where I think most people are probably going to have the biggest issues with this headphone, and it's certainly where my biggest issues are. So there's a 5 kilohertz peak that I see on measurements. I don't really hear this peak. This peak does change a little bit depending on the positioning and the clamp of the headphone, but there is a pretty big dip around the 7 to 8 kilohertz band on this headphone, which then goes into a pretty large peak around 10 kilohertz. And these two things are things I absolutely notice as a coloration, and if I could change one thing about the headphone, it would probably be rebalancing these two aspects, so lowering the 10K region and boosting up the 7 to 8 kilohertz region a bit. I found cutting the 10 kilohertz area really did just help make the overall experience a little bit easier to listen to, but it did also come across as kind of a hit to detail. In terms of kind of the spaciousness effect, I would say because of the way this headphone works on my head, I get more of a sense of lateral width than I do like forward depth or anything like that. So I think that has to do with most of the elements that have a lot of 10 kilohertz energy, so like vocals or snare drums, are usually elements that are panned to the center. And that peak on this headphone on my head makes those things come a little bit forward and closer and kind of sit right above my eyes. Now, I do think a lot of that is very specific to the person's anatomy if they're going to hear the spaciousness the way I do. That said, I think the highlight with this headphone is definitely going to be its sense of dynamism. I think that's definitely where it sets itself apart from basically all of the planars I've heard, except for like the Audeze LCD4 and the Hi-Fi-Man HE6. Yeah, it just portrays kick drums and snare drums with, I think, a lot of the fundamental note weight that comes across because of that upper bass coloration, but it also has enough ear gain, lower treble, and kind of that extra flair in the 1 kilohertz region that I think just brings forth just enough snappiness that you still get like articulate, punchy, heavy sounding transients for drums, which, yeah, is probably my favorite aspect about this headphone versus basically all of the other flagship headphones that either don't do this at all, like a lot of the Hi-Fi-Man or Meze headphones I find just don't really do this quality, or the Focal headphones where they have, I think, a little bit less balanced of a set of colorations such that you do get that sense of snap and kind of really articulate kind of thwack, but the timbre suffers quite a bit more than it does on this headphone. So, but yeah, now let's move into comparisons, where I think the main comparison, I mean, I've already compared it to like the Hi-Fi-Man and kind of Focal sound signature, but the main thing that came to mind with this headphone was the MM500 from Audeze, because that's kind of been my pick for a headphone that's expensive, but still prioritizes neutrality. And while I think there are parts of that headphone that I like more than this one, I actually think overall I prefer the Headphone 2 GT. What I prefer about the Headphone 2 GT is basically everything below like 6 kilohertz. I find that the more colored presentation of the Headphone 2 GT with its upper bass and center mid-range colorations just makes the listen overall just more expressive and kind of vivid, while still kind of retaining that sense of natural presentation that I like about the MM500. What's kind of lacking about the MM500 to me is that its bass just isn't really engaging at all, and it kind of lacks a lot of texturing, both in terms of like bass instruments themselves, but also transients just kind of come across a little bit feathery and kind of muffled. I think largely due to a dip in the low treble that headphone has. This one has just more exciting colorations across the board, but still kind of keeps a linear tilt to the bass and mid-range presentation that comes across as more exciting. I will say, I think overall, I prefer the MM500's 7 to 12 kilohertz region, but even though the Headphone 2 GT is a little bit more uneven in that band to my ear, it comes across as more exciting. When it came to testing them both side to side, I preferred this one because it was just more fun. So yeah, in conclusion, I think the Headphone 2 GT is kind of an underrated headphone. While it's not as laser focused and direct and kind of snappy as the Focal headphones, I do think it still has a very interesting presentation of dynamics and texturing that those headphones have, while kind of balancing it more with its upper bass coloration and being more listenable overall. And yeah, while the Headphone 2 GT isn't quite as detailed or spacious as Hi-Fi-Man options, I actually do think it's a better all-rounder. It sounds more natural and still has some of that cool spaciousness and detail presentation going on. So yeah, I think the Headphone 2 GT is kind of an underrated option for a one and done flagship headphone purchase, and I think people would do well to consider it more than they currently are. So yeah, that's about it for this video. If you want to see more videos like this, definitely make sure to subscribe to the Headphone Show. If you want to discuss this headphone, feel free to find me on our forum at forum.headphones.com or our Discord server at discord.gg/headphones. And if you found this video completely useless, completely unhelpful, definitely make sure to let me know down in the comments. All right, guys, thanks. Bye.